Välkomna allihopa, welcome everyone. Welcome to an evening panel discussion on how we live, work, hate and dream in contemporary Europe. My name is Stefan Jonsson. I'm a professor at Linköping University at the Institute for Research in Migration, Ethnicity and Society, and it's nice to see so many people here, and I think it will be worth spending this evening. We will be addressing a number of urgent topics. This panel discussion is organized by our research institute and Linköping University, but also by a group of international researchers, thinkers, intellectuals who are visiting our institute and Linköping University, involved in a project which you will hear a little bit more about soon. But I need to say that it is funded by the Volkswagen Stiftung, Volkswagen Stiftung, Folkvagnsstiftelse, Folkvagnsstiftelse, the Volkswagen Foundation, which finances this research project. Here to my right, I have 4 of the researchers and intellectuals involved in this project. And I will give the word to them soon. It's from my right or from your left. It's Manuela Bojadzijev, who is professor at the University of Lüneburg and at the Humboldt University in Berlin, where she works at the Institute for Integration and Migration Research. And then we have Opratko from the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna, Gazela Pudar from the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory at the University of Belgrade, and Éric Fassin, University of Paris 8 at Vincennes, and who recently also published a book, which you will hear more about, called Populism, Le Grand Ressentiment, the stora resentimentet, the great resentment, the book on populism. So much of what we will be talking about here tonight is something that is often referred to under the name of populism. But it could also be what in Sweden would be called from the beginning missnöjeskulturer, or nationalism, or racism, or fear of the other, or anti-establishment thinking, or neo-fascism, or fascism. Meaning that we will talk about all these new or new-old tendencies in the political landscape in Europe today, which have over the recent years gradually become more and more influential. So we will talk about why this is the case and what we can do about it. Because all of us united in this research project, we think that something needs to be done about this, and this is why we are first trying to find out why these tendencies are there. So each of the panelists will have about 10 minutes. Manuela will first speak to the project in general, and then the 3 other panelists will speak on different aspects, not only or not even mainly about our research project, but mainly about the issues behind it. And Éric will end with giving us some views on the topic in general and ideas from his most recent book. So welcome to this debate, and after the panelists, there will be an opportunity for the audience and for the other researchers affiliated with this project who are also in the room, I must add. So it's not only the 5 of us, but it's 10 more researchers who are in the room. So we will open the floor for a general discussion, questions and answers to the panelists about these issues. So warmly welcome, and warmly welcome Manuela to start this off.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and hello to everyone. I'm very, very happy to be here. And I would like to describe to you what it is that brings us together in this room, and what we do when we conduct a research project that is or tries to be as complex as the one that Stefan has just described. So an open question to, in one way or the other, an attempt to give a diagnosis of our contemporary times, and why it is that we, or many of us, feel that we are part of an authoritarian turn. And I leave it as open as this to begin with. I'll start to explain the project to you with taking you back for one little moment. And I'll take you back almost, or a little bit more than 4 years ago. It was 2015. And you will all remember that in 2015, during the summer, we saw a migration movement crossing Europe and arriving in different places, and by doing so, showing that the migration regime that has until that point been installed by the European Union did not work. It proved to us that the idea that the borders could be sealed off, no matter what is happening outside in this world and within Europe, can actually work. Okay? There was not only this very experience that something has failed that many people have bought into, and this is a migration policy that has pretended for a very, very long time, actually decades, that what we will do with the mobility of human people is we will make it an exception. Everything that migration is thought of as is an exception to what we think of as our countries as more or less homogeneous, more or less of a consistent of a group of people which has settled down and decided to stay in one country. So we were all confronted with this mobility, and we had to understand in one way or the other that this was part of our realities and actually an expression of a failed situation, which then became a question. And this question was tackled by civil society, and not only civil society, also a lot of local institutions, governmental institutions, trade unions, civil society organizations, which tried to provide as many support and help to actually tackle a situation like this, to welcome people. That was 2015. And ever since, there seems to have happened a shift. And I say it seems to have happened because this is something that we are curious to understand. How come that we saw this strong movement and this strong politics and this strong commitment by so many people to finally accept that human mobility is not an exception and to actually cater for it, provide for this, try to, make space, create things, ideas, not think of it in terms of a lack of resources, but actually to provide resources? How come that we now think that this doesn't exist anymore and that we are in a situation where an authoritarian turn has happened and we all feel somehow we don't have anything that we can really and effectively do against it? Okay, so one thing that many of you will probably have learned during your studies, or because you're occupied with this as scholars, or because you experience this in your lives, is that we all feel that racism has something to do with this. So an acceptance that the world and humans are divided in certain races and that this has a certain order and that this order is something that is meaningful to all of us. And meaningful because racism has one function: it explains the world to us in a certain way. So racism often explains itself through racist explanations. So there's a self-explanatory logic in which racism works. And our sense as researchers across Europe was that what we need to do is to explain the world otherwise. What we need to provide and what our task in a historical situation like this is to say we need to understand the world differently and we need to provide different narratives. And as scholars, we have enough modesty to say we don't know this already. Maybe there is a couple of things that have changed that we were so far unable to explain. Because it's not that we all have only just started to try to understand this. There are many theories in the world how and why racism works, etc. But why do they not work for all of us? Why are we not strong enough to counter these authoritarian movements? Is there something that has changed or not? So we began to organize a research project, which Stefan explained was then finally funded by Volkswagen Stiftung. And I'll explain a little bit about what we do and who we are. So who are we? We are a group of researchers that are based along the migration route of 2015. There's a team of which Gazela is a member at the University of Belgrade. There's a team which is also in this room, from the University of Rijeka in Croatia. And there's a team at the University of Vienna, as you have learned. Benjamin is sitting next to me. There's a team in Germany from the University of Lüneburg and Humboldt University that I'm a member of. And there's a team from Linköping University. And we thought that one of the explanations, one of the racist explanations to explain racism was to say, well, there is an authoritarian turn because there was this movement of migration and people cannot cope with it. It is thus the presence of migrants that makes us racists. Okay? This is only one of the many explanations that we get why there is this authoritarian turn. And this is a clearly racist explanation to explain racism. And we thought, okay, we need a different narrative. Why don't we organize a research project along that migration route and look at how in very different ways in those countries people actually talk about this as one thing. And there are also different aspects of a certain form of crisis or a narrative of crisis, and how does that articulate with this topic of migration? Are there people actually talking about the migrants, or is migration just a figure? Something that works like a seismograph of how people talk about the conditions of their democracy, etc. And so what do? we combine 3 social spaces from which we start our research. One is that we begin in work environments. And we figured out that we somehow need to start at some point. And we wanted to start in 2 sectors of the economy. One is logistics and the other one is retail. And these 2 sectors are affected in an important way, also differently from place to place, from site to site, where we do the investigations, by, for example, innovation through digitization. And of course, you will also probably know that there is another narrative that tells us because there is a transformation of labor and the workplace through digitalization that people can't cope with, that they turn authoritarian. Okay, so we want to know, is that true? Is that really true? Is that the way people think about things? And we also have learned that it is actually the digital environments of social media that have somehow filtered, accelerated, etc., the way how the authoritarian turn has actually been strengthened. Is that true? We would like to know. So we combine a research starting from these work environments and looking into the digital environments of the people that we research. And then there's a third aspect where we think that we cannot only talk to people, we also need to understand how they do, how and if at all, they live an authoritarian turn. So how does it become acceptable in their everyday lives that they think that the authoritarian solution is a solution that somehow responds to the situations in their lives? So it's these 3 environments that we try to combine in this research design. The work environments, the digital environments, and what we call the socio-spatial environments, which are the neighborhoods. The neighborhoods that we get told are affected by transformation, closure of public swimming pools, closure of schools, closure of kindergarten, is a certain form of austerity politics that has affected our everyday lives. How do people make sense of this? So it's these 3 environments that we research, and we do work with trade unions in all 5 sites that help us contact workers, but then we don't do a labor sociology, we don't investigate their labor situation, but we look into the everyday lives of these workers. And finally, there is an international board. One of the members is here, Éric Fassin, because of course, if there is this narrative that along the migration route there is racism, how do we explain the rise of the Front National in France if France has not been affected by the 2015 migration movement? So we wanted to open up a dialogue with the project and our findings with people from countries where the narrative is the same, but obviously the situation isn't. And so to contrast our experiences with that one. So what it is that we try to do is, in a way, we try to include into the research design already a certain perspective that will help us to look at these questions, at these narratives that are provided to explain to us why there is an authoritarian terms in other ways. So what we did is we basically try to understand how do we have to arrange a project that help us to look at things in different ways. And this is what we do when we are interested in cultures of rejections and how they are acceptable. But what we mostly want to find out is how do people actually reject that form of rejection? How do they resist that? What kind of narratives exist that say we will not obey to this authoritarian term? Thank you.
Thank you, Manuela. I will hand the microphone to Gazela, Pudar. Please tell us what narratives we may find in this and what we are beginning to see.
Well, yes, I should give some overview of what so far research which we had in the field gave us as a result. I will just emphasize that I will start from the beginning of this route, from Serbia, where I'm coming from, through Croatia and then Austria and Germany. I just want to say that in Sweden, Swedish team is in the beginning of its fieldwork, so for the moment we cannot say much about what is the situation in Sweden, except that it's difficult to approach the potential informants in the field. So I would like to start from Serbia, basically, which is country which is not facing authoritarian turn, it's facing authoritarian rule for the moment. And I think among all these countries, Serbia is the most authoritarian, with the most authoritarian regime, thank you. And findings which we are having in Serbia are showing the strong distrust, and this is also repeated again in Croatia and also in Austria, strong distrust towards institutions, towards parties, and towards media as manipulative media. And in Serbia there is a huge apathy among the citizens, among our informants, so they basically retreat from the public sphere, they retreat to private sphere, they tend to think of themselves as somebody who is engaged only with their friends and family, not beyond that. They are not engaging in any kind of public action, whether political or not, so this is something which is really relevant. And it's very difficult to grasp any kind of othering and any kind of rejection when you are talking with them. Basically, this is maybe in terms of migration, which was stressed here in the beginning, and that's why we have all these countries along the migration route from 2015 onwards. Maybe this is the case because in Serbia we had very openly politics of not rejecting the migrants, contrary, accepting the migrants, but accepting them as somebody who is passing the country, not staying in the country. So we knew from the beginning, and that was strong narrative in the media during the whole thing, that these people are coming just to pass to Germany, basically, Austria or Germany, but Germany mostly because of invitation of Prime Minister Merkel. And this was enormously helpful not to create a sense of rejection of migrants. So basically in Serbia we have much bigger issues which are not so strong in interviews, and we are really looking forward to see what is going to happen in the further fieldwork. We have much more division between metropolis as Belgrade and inner Serbia, so what is basically province and what is the capital, that is the strongest difference which we found out. But I just want to say one vignette from Serbia, which might be interesting especially for the Swedish audience, because the role of trade unions here is very strong. I mean, as we have heard today, strongest in Europe. And in Serbia, we had, let's say 1 or 2 months ago, a case where we had 3 men died in explosion in the metal, in the chemistry factory, which is producing something for defense. And it's a public factory, so it's not privately owned. And we had basically director of this factory who was prosecuted, but the trade union of this factory organized its employees to come and to rally against the families of these people, these 3 men who died. So they were protesting against them as those who are asking for the justice for their own died members. So this is the role of trade unions in Serbia. It's completely twisted, basically, in a way. So this is just one of the vignettes I wanted to share with you. I now move to Croatia as the second in the row. The Croatia is the country which stands for the moment as a guardian of the Europe towards the migrants. And this is very visible also in the results of this research, because in Croatia we have the biggest rejection of the migrants. And in Croatia we have something, again, another vignette. The migrants call the thing which they are engaged with as the game. What does it mean, the game? It means that they are engaging in attempts to cross the border, and they call this the game because it's very dangerous for them. It's repetitive, so they tried several times. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they do not, but they crossed several borders so far until coming to Croatia. And there are also very, very violent pushbacks by the Croatian border and Croatian police, border police. So they are returned illegally, basically, to Bosnia and Herzegovina, where they are trying to cross the border, because the police of Croatia is illegally coming to Bosnia to leave them there. So this is a very dangerous attempt which involves a lot of actors. So those are who are helping them to cross the border, police, and themselves who are very exhausted in the end. And this issue in Croatia is very huge for the moment. There are even reports that are claiming that this is illegal. And this is hidden in a way. I mean, it's not hidden, it's public, so people know about this. But still, there are narratives in the public who are produced by the government, like, for example, the president of Croatia, who is claiming that this is all legal and they are doing nothing, but they are just like pushing the migrants and not beating, but just pushing them back. So, I mean, this is the narrative which they have. Now we actually skipped Slovenia on this way, but we go to Austria and Germany, and basically we have some similarity between these two countries, which is somehow expected, like we had some similarity between Serbia and Croatia, which are neighboring. But basically, there are cultures of rejections of the migrants, which we noticed just in Austria, and I guess you all know, we are all familiar with also political situation where there is a rise of the right wing of FPO, and there is also crisis of the government, the current government, which was there were elections, and you know everything basically about that, I hope. But there is a narrative of the workers which were informants in this fieldwork, who reject migrants as somebody who is basically unemployed, non-working, and who is burden for their social welfare system. This is somehow repeated also in Germany, but not on this, as far as I understood, not on the same level. And there is a difference between Austria and Germany, because in Austria they observe themselves as somebody who is deserving their status, their situation. They're working hard, and basically they are very meritocratic in a way. They are performers. They do the things, and that's why they are satisfied with their life. They are satisfied basically with their workplace. They like what they do, while these are coming just to take them these benefits. And also, what is the case with also in Austria and Germany, there is a clear separation between the labor world and the political world, so that they do not see any kind of dependence between these two spheres. So what they see about the labor world is that it's self-dependent. It has its own rules, and it doesn't basically depends much about from what is happening in politics and political sphere. In Germany, in the end, there is narrative of rejection of the migrants and refugees, but also unemployed in a way. because they are taking some benefits. But there is some kind, I think it's also reflection, at least for me, of this narrative of Angela Merkel as Germany a welcoming country for all people, basically, because they are saying something like that we all should be more human and there should be more humanity in society, and they are basically seeing themselves as welcoming people. So this is, I think, reflecting what we have heard in the official discourse. And also there is a focus which I think repeats in all these countries, but here in Germany it was emphasized in the findings that we should focus more on us and not on these other who are coming. And what does it mean, us? It means the elderly, it means homeless, and it means children. So those who cannot really take care of themselves in our community, in our country. So there is a little bit of showing basically the rejection of those foreigners who are coming here, and we should take care of us. And in Germany also there was a negative perception of the society, in a way, of a general development of society, because they see that there is no any more togetherness, so there is a lack of social cohesion today. And they also reflect this in the workspace where they work. So it's the customers are changing. There is like this rude attitude which is showing more and more than it used to be. So before it was nice, polite community, and now we do not have anymore this kind of connectedness between people and this kind of politeness, I would say, between the people. And I think I would finish with this, and we can also answer some more from the specific themes in the further discussion.
Thank you, Gazela. I will hand the microphone to Benjamin. I will also ask you, Benjamin, to explain something that's been mentioned by Manuela and Gazela, is this concept or this word expression that you have been using, cultures of rejection. In Swedish, this would be retranslated into avvisandets kulturer. Why are we using that idea rather than speaking about the authoritarian turn or racism or anti-everything attitudes? Mm-hmm. If you could bake that into your answer to me.
That's an ambush. Good evening. To attempt to very briefly answer your question, I mean, we kind of came up with this term, or we invented this term when we planned this research project, because we felt that a lot of the terms that are floating around both in the academic world and in the wider social and political debate do not really adequately capture the dynamics that we wanted to investigate and that Manuela talked about and that Gazela talked about right now. Which means that we would not want to, first and foremost, focus on practices of political representation, on practices of political propaganda or ideologies. But on the other hand, we also wouldn't want to look at attitudes or public opinions as if that would be an objective reality that we can somehow, in a positivistic way, measure and then put into figures and graphs, but rather to investigate a very dynamic field, a social field, and also a field that is made up of everyday actions, routines, and in the end, cultures as ways of living, ways of struggling. So that's the reason for choosing cultures of rejection, or choosing the cultures part. And on the other hand, we deliberately wanted to leave open the question what exactly it is that is being rejected when people invest in these kinds of cultures, when these cultures become parts of everyday life. I mean, we do have some educated guesses, and of course this has to do with migration and racism, as to what kinds of objects, what kinds of practices are being rejected. But we also see that the kind of phenomena we are interested in are interesting in a way because they connect, they link different objects in ways that are not objectively reasonably to be, there's nothing objectively in the essence of these objects that are rejected that would link them together in a kind of logical way. And also in different places, these objects of rejection, say the mainstream media, migrants, Muslims, Roma, but also people who ride bikes, homosexuals, the politicians. You will find some combination, some versions, some other combinations and other versions in different places, and we wanted to look at these phenomena in a way that would not beforehand pretend that we know what it is that is being linked with each other and then turned into becoming part of such everyday cultures. So I hope this somehow addresses this question. What I wanted to add to the presentations up until now is, well, maybe it's not very imaginative of me, but I thought it would be interesting to speak about the case of Austria a little bit more in detail, even though you said that probably everybody knows everything about Austria anyways. If I think about how much I know about Sweden, then maybe you're much more interested in Austria than I am, the other way around. But there might be, no, I should not continue with this thought. Still, I think it's interesting. It might be interesting for some of you to hear some more about the case of Austria, because I think it's an interesting case for at least two, maybe three reasons. First of which is, in recent history, Austria and the Austrian far right has had a kind of avant-garde role when it comes to the development of what I would like to call authoritarian populism or far-right populism. The Freedom Party of Austria, as some of you may know, started its success story already in the late 1980s, and it was one of the first, if not the first, that adopted this kind of political strategy and image that was very much a kind of best practice model that was followed by a lot of parties in different parts of Europe, including, I believe, the Sweden Democrats in later years. The fact that this started in Austria, has its own particular historical reasons that I won't go into the details of now, but it shows us at least one particular important thing, something that was already mentioned by Manuela before, namely that we must not succumb to this very easy and lazy, if I may say, explanation that links the fact of migration, the fact of migration movements in any easy way to the rise of the far right. Because if you look at the rise of the Freedom Party of Austria, and you look at the different cycles and movements of migration, you will not find any clear correlation. This misunderstanding, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, so I won't go into any more details on that. But I think that the Freedom Party of Austria, also in a historical perspective, is a very interesting case because it, from a very early stage onwards, was successful in linking different topics, linking different, we would now say, objects of rejection in a very effective way that also led them to be for a long time the most successful far-right party in Europe, and at least in what is usually called Western Europe, and which also led them into government at a very, very early stage, namely in the year 2000. Which brings me to the second point, that in Austria you can observe now for a longer period of time, and now over two periods of the far right being part of a coalition government, the first between 2000 and 2005, the second between 2017 up until this summer. It gives us a drastic example of how the strategies of the far right on the one hand, and the social and cultural dynamics that this entails, and the cultures of rejection that become meaningful in this context, how this can change and transform the social and political landscape of a country like Austria in a very long-term way. And this is not just to say, as it has been in other countries, that, for example, social democratic parties tend to emulate or to pander to the far right on issues such as migration. They think that in order to win back voters that they think they are losing to the far right, they have to be tougher on questions such as asylum, migration, crime, and others. I mean, we see that in a lot of different places in Europe for some years now, and it's usually not very successful, even on their own terms. But what we also see in some places in Austria is a prime example for that, is that in a kind of extreme way, you find parties such as the Austrian Conservative Party reinventing themselves as literally a copy of far-right populist, authoritarian populist parties, which makes them literally indistinguishable in both form and content from what is usually, from the so-called political center, seen as this kind of unruly, dangerous, still, not very respectable far-right parties. The story of the last Austrian coalition government, which ended this summer after a very interesting video surfaced that some of you might have heard about. The story of this government is the story of a coalition government between two authoritarian populist parties, one of which has always started out as a populist party, as an authoritarian party, and one of which having reinvented themselves really along these lines, which also means that in the election of 2017, which was the election won by the Conservative Party under then later Bundeskanzler Sebastian Kurz, the young guy with the funny hair, you basically had an election result that saw more than 60% of the voters electing authoritarian populist parties. It was an election campaign in which the Conservative Party really campaigned on two issues only, one of which was the closing of the so-called Balkan route. And this brings us back to the topic that Manuela started with. And I'd like to finish with this. It is a great pleasure to see, and I, even while I'm here, I'm checking my phone all the time because, well, for many reasons, because of unhealthy media practices, but also because it was just announced that the Freedom Party, there's actually a split from the Freedom Party led by the former Vice Chancellor and long-time leader of the Freedom Party, Heinz-Christian Strache, because there was this fallout after this Ibiza video surfaced, which I will not go into the details of, but which showed basically Strache and his lieutenant selling off Austrian assets to what they thought was Russian oligarchs' niece. But in the kind of aftermath of that, all kinds of things surfaced. The most important of which was that Strache himself has embezzled party money for many, many years, millions of it. He made the party pay for his personal whirlpool. among other things. Yeah, he actually claimed that this was part of what he had to do for representational matters. But he also let his party pay for Clash of Titans, the game on his phone, so that was much more difficult to defend. Anyways, what we have now is, and as I said, it's beautiful to watch. We have this daily infight between the different figures of the far right, the split right through the party. We see them plummeting in the polls, below 15, below 12%. In the latest polls, they were even below the Green Party, which is traditionally not very strong in Austria. And we have a lot of leftist and liberal commentators and journalists who, they're jubileeing, and they basically write off the far right. They say, well, they have again proven to be completely incompetent, to be corrupt, to be incapable of doing respectable politics, of leading a country, and now they're even doing all these infights, and it's embarrassing to watch. And we are waking up from this nightmare, and we are going back to respectable politics with respectable parties of the center. And I think this is exactly why projects like ours are so important, because what we are trying to get at is that the conditions which made this possible, an authoritarian populist government that really in the past 2 years made lots of efforts to turn Austria into a kind of state model that's copying in some ways the Hungarian model, that is Hungary under Viktor Orban, that the conditions that make this possible are still there, are ripe, have not been tackled. And any idea that this is now the time to freely breathe again and be glad that the nightmare is over, that it was like a fever that you have to go through from time to time, and after that you feel good and healthy again as a democracy, that this is a very wrong and dangerous way of misunderstanding the dynamics of the authoritarian turn, of authoritarian populism and its social cultural dimensions. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. And I go to Éric Fassin. Can you start to say something about how we should explain these tendencies? Or how would you explain?
Thank you so much for such an easy question to start with. First, I'm very glad to be here, and thank you for having me as part of this project. I'm an external member, which means that I don't do the work, but I come in and criticize what they're doing. So it's great. I love it. I recommend that. As you heard, I'm here as a French person, and so I will play the role of a French person, and in particular by sort of confirming that we don't need to have many migrants to be xenophobic. This we knew was a racist argument. That is basically, if you say it's because there are too many Jews that there's anti-Semitism, you sort of guess that it might be anti-Semitic, and in the same way for xenophobia. But we have confirmation in the case of France. That is, in 2015, I was listening to Manuela presenting this sort of huge movement of people opening their arms. And I thought, wow, this is a German story, not a French story, because a few thousand people came to France and it was slightly embarrassing. So that's one element. But I don't just want to limit myself to the French case. I also want to open up on a variety of countries, and the fact that what has been happening since we have elections in Britain today, I think the discussion about populism started in the new formulation with the Brexit. That's when people started saying something new, not just there are far-right people who are populists, sometimes often assimilated with the working class. But the idea was that these were not fascists, these were good people who had good reasons to be xenophobic, and you had to be understanding. This was an argument that first appeared at the time of Brexit, then resurfaced a few months later with the election of Trump, when people started saying, you have to understand these people. It's for good reasons that they're sick and tired of all this. And this argument has been going on and on and on. Well, I think this argument has to be taken seriously in order to criticize it and show that it's first theoretically wrong, second empirically false, and third politically dangerous. So that's the general idea of what I will be presenting. The first thing is that if you look at what's happened in the name of right-wing populism, you realize that the result has been right-wing leaders, and these right-wing leaders have been anything but enemies of neoliberalism. A case in point is Donald Trump. I mean, he's not exactly the enemy of Wall Street. Another case in point is Brazil with Bolsonaro. In fact, it's precisely when he hired a minister of the economy who's one of the Chicago boys that he could be elected. That is, it's the opposite of the usual story of people reacting against neoliberalism. Well, you could say people were mistaken, they misunderstood. That's not true, because in fact, they keep supporting these leaders. Otherwise, Trump would be out of office. So what it means is that what has been presented as a reaction against neoliberalism is a symptom of neoliberalism. And the consequence is how we interpret this will mean how we mobilize politically against it. And in particular, in the French case, what we've seen, and it's not just in France, of course, is the rise of a new political logic which claims to be left-wing populism. Left-wing populism in the case of La France Insoumise, the movement of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, but you have versions of this in Spain, and you have versions of this in Germany, and you have versions of this in various countries. So the idea has been, well, if people are unhappy with neoliberalism, for the moment, they turn to far-right populists. We have to make sure that they come our way, and therefore we have to develop a kind of left-wing populism. Well, I think this is why we have to understand what is going on, both with these voters, but more generally with the rise of what I would prefer to call neo-fascist movements. As you may know, there's a philosopher who's been very influential in all this, Chantal Mouffe, who had worked with Ernesto Laclau, and recently, in the last few years, has prolonged and continued by insisting on this notion of a populist moment. Talking about a populist moment means that, in fact, both the right-wing populists and the left-wing populists have something in common. Otherwise, you wouldn't call them all populists. What they have in common, she would argue, and many left-wing populists would argue, like Jean-Luc Mélenchon, of course it's not xenophobia. Of course it's not racism. Therefore, what is it? It's the rejection of neoliberalism. Now, that is why interpreting what is going on is so important, because strategies derive from the analysis. When we look at what's happened with left-wing populism, the risk, of course, is that if you say what they have in common is not xenophobia, then you have to argue that there's something in common, which Chantal Mouffe has called a democratic nucleus. That is the idea that right-wing populists are on the side of democracy. And they're just complaining about the fact that in neoliberal societies, unfortunately, there's less and less politics. That Tony Blair and Bill Clinton and all these social democrats who converted to neoliberalism have sort of emptied politics of its political content, and so they have democratized our democracies. I agree with that. However, I don't agree with the response. The response has been to say, well, politics in the old way, right and left, is not crucial any longer. In fact, Sure, you can still say left-wing populism and right-wing populism, but the essential thing is populism. That's the substantive. And then you can sort of differentiate between two versions of the substantive, that is, populism of the left, populism of the right. Now, I think we should turn things around and insist on the importance of right and left. Why? Because in fact, if the idea is to resist the logic of depoliticization that is central in neoliberalism, then we have to go against the mantra of Margaret Thatcher, which, as you know, was there is no alternative. There is no alternative means that it's not about ideology. It's about reality. The realism that she pleaded for and that neoliberals have pleaded for is the idea that there are no choices because reality imposes its reality upon us, and not that we have different political options. I think we have to do the opposite. And so basically saying that there's populism on the left, there's populism on the right, is just a way of saying that left and right are secondary, therefore that ideology is not essential to politics, that reality is really what determines. And so in a way, it justifies the position of Margaret Thatcher, and I think it forces people to believe that politics doesn't matter. The result is that people don't vote for left-wing populists, neither in Germany nor in France, because in fact it's not because Jean-Luc Mélenchon was sort of winning over people from the far right that he did better in the last election. It's because he got all his votes from the Socialist Party that was abandoned by anyone on the left. So in fact, it's not a good strategy. What is important then is to think of what we need to do. What kind of a good strategy? And that's why I think we have to think about the affects that are mobilized in politics. Instead of saying just that there are emotions in politics, which is vague, I think we should insist on differentiating between affects on the left and affects on the right. And in particular, I have suggested that left-wing affects can be, for example, indignation, which is not the same as a right-wing affect, which plays a major role in today's politics, which is resentment. In both cases, you're not happy with the world. But there's a big difference. Resentment is not just against bankers. It's also against the Roma. It's also against Muslims. It's also against gays. So in fact, it's not just a hierarchical resentment going upwards. It goes both upwards and downwards. The difference, in my view, between indignation and resentment is central to understanding what is going on today. Indignation is the feeling that the world is not fair, not just because I'm not privileged. Even if I'm privileged, that doesn't mean that the world is fair. Resentment starts with me and stops with me because I don't want the world to be just. On the contrary, I want to have privileges compared to the Roma, compared to Muslims, compared to gays, etc. So in fact, what I would argue is that resentment is based on a desire for inequality, whereas indignation is based on a desire for equality. This means, if I'm right, and of course I believe that I'm right, but let's assume temporarily that I'm right. If I'm right, that means that we have to take seriously the opposition between right and left, between a desire for equality and a desire for inequality, because any other strategy will not work. On the contrary, it will reinforce those who say, oh, it doesn't matter because there's no alternative. So instead of targeting fascists, instead of thinking that we have to woo them over so that they will sort of come to the left side, I would argue that we have to start with people who are disgusted with politics, in particular people who don't vote, because people who don't vote are saying something politically very important, is that they're disgusted with politics, and this is a political statement. And why are they disgusted with politics? Because they think politics doesn't change things, because they think you vote for this one or that one, the result will be the same. So if you want to go against this disgust with politics, you have to show that it does make a difference. And instead of saying the real difference is between the elite and the people, which are sociological groups, you have to start from ideology. That is, the big divide is ideological between a desire for equality and a desire for inequality. Thanks.
Thank you all four. I'm going to pose one question that you could answer more briefly than you did now. I mean, more briefly. You didn't answer any question now. You had your 10 minutes, right? So, but let's take 1 or 2 minutes each to answer this question, which I think is important because it's in the Swedish. It also brings into in the Swedish case a little bit. But thanks first. That was incredibly interesting to hear all of this, and it was interesting to hear the case from Austria that the FPÖ, the Freedom Party of Austria, is now falling apart. I think if you contrast that to the sense we have here in Sweden right now, is that it's quite the opposite. It's like, as we are researching this, but I think that's a general sense many have, the figures for these authoritarian right-wing parties continue to go up. So when we are finished with our research, they will be in power, at least in this country. I mean, that's a real realization that people are beginning to have here now, that this will be the biggest party in a new coalition government within 2 years. That's a real scenario. Even to the extent that people have started to think that you can't really protest against the Sweden Democrats any longer. You have to just accept them as they are, as a part, natural part of the political landscape. So when 6-8 years ago, there would be mobilizations against them every time they had a meeting in the square and people were protesting, no racists in our street, and so on and so forth. Now they have become normalized to a large extent, especially in media, and of course they have places in parliament. They have 20% of the votes, so we simply have to accept that they are as any other party. They recently, I'm bringing this up here too, because there was recently a discussion about a lecture in Gothenburg where the School of Journalism in Gothenburg invited representatives of all the parliamentary parties to speak about their media strategies. So then they also invited the secretary of the Sweden Democrats, who inviting him to speak about their media strategies. And for the leadership and the people behind this, it seemed like, yeah, well, this is an education, propaganda and journalism, so let's hear from them as well, especially as they are very skilled at it. Number of people protested and wrote in against this, and a number of people, including myself, signed petitions and articles against this and say, well, we as a university, we don't need to accept this. I mean, we are not a representative assembly in that sense that we need to accept all voices on equal terms. Straightforward and good argument, especially as the university has its so-called value ground in democracy and equal rights and human rights and so on. So there is a basis to make that statement and to make a decision to simply not invite them if you dislike, if you think they're an undemocratic force. My question to you is, to what extent in your respective situations, in your countries, as teachers, as intellectuals, as thinkers, and as also representatives of the institution of the university, do you or do we feel affected or threatened or having to address this situation in various ways? And I think I would start with Gazela, because I think it's also your case. But I would like all of us to see, because we need to start to build also protective walls around these arenas for critical and free speech.
Well, thank you. You're definitely right. And there is a reason why Stefan gave me the microphone first. Because I'm coming from the institute, which is part of the University of Belgrade, who is for the moment, and it's not for the moment, it's last 9 months, under attack of the regime. And there is... To start from the beginning, we signed in the end of January, we signed a letter as whole team of the Institute, 30-something people. We signed a letter of support for citizens' protests, civic protests, which were happening in Serbia and which are still going on. And we were very careful not to support any political options, so it was support to citizens who were insatisfied with their conditions of life based on these results of our own research, which we have. Well, that fired back to us. In a way, the government appointed the governing board, which is like the higher body governing the institute, extremely right-wing people who should control and basically, in a way, punish the institute and its team because of this sign of dissent, let's say like that. And this is not the only thing which is happening. In a way, when you are attacked, then you start making contacts and coalition with people who are in similar situation. And after that, we basically discovered that there is a hidden, so behind the curtain, deliberate process of controlling, of putting under control all educational institutions, higher educational institutions and scientific institutions in Serbia. What it means? It means that government is using its own rights as founder of these institutions to appoint the persons who will basically control what is happening in this. And this is, of course, extremely endangering academic freedom, is extremely endangering freedom of speech. So we are basically controlled through this, not to go into public and oppose to what is happening in the Serbia, not to act as intellectuals. So speaking about your own results, you don't have basically to do core political work. You just can go and speak about the results of your own research. That is something which is extremely endangering. And this is part of the wider process which is happening even now. For the moment, academia is under very strong pressure and attacks, and we even have MPs in the parliament who are openly stating that some of the representatives of academic community should be punished according to law of King Miloš, which means they should be put in the jail, basically in a very severe manner. So I think that the role of academic community and our role is very important, because in the times where there is a limited space and limited time for you to say anything which can oppose to this dominant neoliberal right-wing populist moment, then you really have to act and you really have to go beyond this academic community, which is frequently happening, that you close yourself in this ivory tower, as we call it, and you have to step into public and try to help those who are fighting political battles to have arguments, at least, which might help them to do the work and make a turn in a different way.
Thanks. Do you want to continue?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that the previous government, made up of the Conservative Party turned authoritarian and the original authoritarian party, in my view and the view of some of my colleagues, pursued a strategy that we could call a state project. They wanted to transform the institutional setup of the state. However, they were stopped midway or quarter of the way, whatever their long-term plans was, not because they were stopped by protests or the judicial system, but because of their own shortcomings. So we are living at the moment in Austria, I would say not on borrowed time, but on gifted time. In the 1.5 to 2 years that they were able to pursue their strategies, the universities have not yet become a strategic objective. They decided that other institutions and places were more important in the short term for them to transform and basically to get their own people in. And this was mainly the police forces, it was mainly the military and the secret services. It was also the central bank, it was the statistical office. They did not succeed with every move because in some way they are still dilettantes in what they are doing. But they very carefully tried to implement their program and in transforming the respective places and spaces. I have absolutely no doubt that the universities at some time would have been the target of more open attacks, as we have seen in ways that Gazela just talked about, and in ways that, of course, we have seen just across the border from Austria in Hungary, which still remains, at least for the Freedom Party, the number one model of how a state and society should look like. And there's a kind of irony in the fact that the Central European University, you might have heard about that, which had to basically flee from Hungary, has now resettled in Vienna. And when the recent government was still in office, between ourselves, we kind of chuckled and said, well, let's see how long that lasts, because a couple of years later, maybe they have to resettle again when the Hungarian model has really set foot in Austria. But so far, this has not happened. So I think, yeah.
I should clarify, because this is something that people tend to think. And when you come from Germany, you actually do not come from heaven. And there is no such thing as a widespread, super great and welcoming, generous culture. And also, Angela Merkel is not the angel that many people portray her as. It is an interesting point to portray her as that, because there were things that the government has not decided to do, and this was to actually shoot at the border to push back people. So the narrative that in Germany the borders were actually opened is a narrative that was invented by the youth movement of the right extremist party Alternative für Deutschland. They spread that idea, and it was extremely powerful. And I don't know how many panels I had to go through by saying Angela Merkel did not open the borders. She just decided that the costs of shooting people at the borders would be something she doesn't want to pay. And that's really, really good. But what happened after that is an unseen tightening of migration policies. So while there has been this reception of opening, at the same time there has been a political program which has been put into place that is extremely responding to the demands of sealing the borders. And it is only, I would say, and I'll come back to your question in a minute, but I just really have to clarify this point. It is only on the European level where this becomes a problem for the German government, and that's an extremely interesting point, where civil society organizations have decided to rescue people in the Mediterranean and have pushed European governments to accept refugees in very small numbers, but by doing so, constantly and continuously saying there is something that you do not solve here, and it is an ongoing problem, and the price that humanity is paying for this is one that none of us want to pay. Okay, so speaking of Germany, I would say, given all this, the situation in terms of an authoritarian party is definitely not resolved. Yeah, Éric has been talking about this, this interpretive framework of an understanding of people who would vote for the right, who would accept authoritarian turns. We have seen all of this in German discussion, right down to the liberal and also to the left parties. And to a degree that I think had the effect that Benjamin has described, that a lot of right-wing turn has happened actually outside of the right extremist party. But what we have also seen that from some point on, it seems to be that there has been a questioning of that position, actually something where people began to resist against it on the media level, also in governmental levels. And this is that there is a certain degree of inacceptance of the AfD, which is to a degree an attempt to keep them out of power, although they are part of the parliament. So this is something that we still see is happening, where the other parties are not ready to accept coalitions with this party, and where from in different positions they're being kept out until today. So given that, there is actually also a rhetoric of how can scholarship contribute to democracy? And that's strong, and it comes from the ministry, it comes from the head of universities, etc., etc. So there is a demand to scholars to actually speak out and present their work, which has also to do with the questioning of another phenomenon, and this is the questioning that actually there is a climate crisis that we have. So that was definitely in Germany not acceptable. People thought, this is a way of not accepting truth that we cannot, that we will not obey to. And this connection is actually something that is going on at the moment, and it's quite interesting because that people are not ready to say, well, all of these things about the climate is actually wrong, has a lot to do with the Friday for Future movement. Because the Friday for Future movement has very clearly shown that there is a movement that can bring back into all of our agendas and everyday lives the very fact that we need to face a crisis of humanity as we know it, and we have to do something, and we know that the politicians do not do what they have to do, although there are facts. And there is an interesting contradiction going on here that at the same time somehow resonates with the question of democracy and how democratic such a change in climate politics has to be. And that's, I think, a moment where I think certain movements and ideas are coming together, and that happens also a lot within scholarship at the moment in Germany.
I understand the question as being, as an academic, how am I affected by what I have described as a neo-fascist moment of neoliberalism? 4 points in 2 minutes. One, what affects me, and I think most academics most directly, is neoliberalism. It has consequences on my work, on my ability to work or be distracted by all kinds of other things, on my ability to speak up politically, publicly, etc., etc. So that's the first point. The main problem in my life as an academic is the neoliberal evolution of universities. The second point is, as a specialist of gender studies, I'm quite aware of the fact that gender studies are under threat, somewhat in France, but in many countries, and we're actually organizing, and in particular, I'm very proud that I contributed to the foundation of something called, and the name I suggested, the Gender International, and which is a solidarity network in defense of gender studies under attack. And so this is in many countries, and it has reverberations in France, although we have managed reasonably well so far, but it's been virulent in Hungary, it's been virulent in Brazil, etc. The third point is that personally I'm also affected, but it's not so important, but by the fact of daily harassment on Twitter, etc., with insults and threats, etc., including receiving death threats at home, etc. But that's not what takes more time or what I find most important. The fourth point is that I would say that this affects me in a positive way, all of this, because it means a responsibility, since I'm lucky enough to have a job in the university. So it's a responsibility to speak up on the one hand, but also to try and do the work that we're paid to do, that is to try and understand a little bit better what is going on so that it can be used by others as well.
Thank you. We're going to open the floor for questions and comments. Let's see. I will ask you to, I think we have another microphone here which we can use. It's sort of hanging around. So yeah, it's there. So I will turn that on. And then let's take a couple of questions and see where we end up. Could someone, Nancy, perhaps, could you go with this microphone? Who would like to say something? Or ask something? We have one here, and who else? So let's take two. Okay, we'll start with one.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for such a wonderful talk. Right from the onset, I was a little bit skeptical about this culture of rejections. I thought the concept of gluttony, sort of putting the culture of welcoming against the culture of anti-migration as two equal cultures, because the other one I think is like not culture, it's hate. But I think your explanation made it make so much sense for me, because you are trying to take all these factors together to describe this culture of rejection, which is great. Thank you so much for this. And I also like this concept of this indignation and resentment. I find it very important, especially for me as being an active member in the Swedish Left Party. And this Left Party is sort of now, there's some debates that the Left Party is really similar to the Right Party in the sense that they both are populist. But the only difference in the Left Party, as you mentioned, is this indignation and resentment. This is very important. The difference, besides that our Left Party has international aims, international solidarity. So this takes it far away from the populist discourse and being a populist party. So I have two more points that I want to mention. I have a question to you about. The first one was because you are trying to investigate these cultural projections and trying to measure all the different factors which are sort of piling up in this culture. I have some sort of methodological problem in the way this project is being, or similar projects are being launched or being carried upon. Is that I come from the Middle East, so we have different methodological approach to social questions. So this is all. I can't elaborate more on that. It's just like, if you please, or you have the room for that, to open up for other methodological approaches in order to understand these factors of cultural projections. So my questions, now my direct questions to you, is that how do you see the effect of globalism in these discussions? Because, I mean, have you interviewed people who have been like transnational, who have been mobile, who have traveled around, who have like friends all over the globe? How do they receive these anti-migration or the cultural projection discourses? And how can globalism or this open world or whatever policy we want to call, how can this be a component of our local politics in terms of sort of combating these anti-migration discourses? Thank you so much.
So who would like to say something?
Or should we respond right away?
Okay.
It's about the project, so.
Ja,
Was
stimmt.
sagst du, was du mit
Ich kann nichts zum Tode sagen, weil ich weiß nicht, was er da wollte.
Is this thing on? Yes. Regarding the question of methods, I don't think I can give a very straightforward answer to it, except to say that we are making a lot of efforts to include a broad set of different methodological approaches, which also is kind of unavoidable because of the inter or transdisciplinary nature of the consortium itself, which includes political scientists, sociologists, ethnographers. So this is also part of, I think, the beautiful challenge of this project to integrate and to kind of make different disciplinary and methodological approaches kind of resonate with each other. I think that's all I can say, but maybe we can talk afterwards about some other approaches that you might have had in mind. The second question regarding globalism, I think I can speak at least for the Austrian research team that the people that we talk to and that are our informants and whose lives we try to understand, most of them, because of the sites that we go to, which is retail sector and logistics sector, most of them have not been born in the place where they work. Most of them consider themselves migrants. Most of them have some kind, they are part of transnational networks just because parts of their friends and families are spread across the globe. And what we find, in this very limited number of cases that we have until now investigated, what we find is that this does not necessarily mean that this becomes a kind of resource to resist these cultures of rejection. Sometimes to the opposite. Personally, the most drastic examples of racism that I've encountered in interviews and talks came from people who have themselves migrated to Austria, and who I think find in the rejection of more recent migrants and of refugees a resource that allows them to kind of inscribe them into a different community, to inscribe them into a position of dominance. And I think there's much more to this than that. But yeah, so much for the question of globalism.
May I add something?
Yes, you have something, and then we'll take.
I'll be very brief. I think it's maybe interesting for you to know that in Croatia we had people who were working in sea ferries as respondents. So those are obviously people who are traveling around the globe. But there is one interesting thing that due to security measures, they are not anymore visiting the places where they go. So they mostly stay on board. And also due to technological advancement, meaning having phones, which are all connected to internet all the time, they don't even communicate among themselves in this small community, but they communicate with their friends and family back at home. So there is a sense of isolation, and there is not really the connections to other people, but there is also strong rejection culture among them. So this is maybe relevant.
More questions? See if there is a second one, we can take it. So we have.
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering, you said before that there shouldn't be a correlation between neoliberalism and people still vote for right-wing populists, even though they perform neoliberalistic politics and policies. But are you sure that the people voting for are aware of the neoliberalistic policies that they make? They don't claim to be neoliberals themselves, at least not here in Sweden, if you understand the question.
People meaning politicians or the people who vote?
The people who vote.
So let's say that and take. So okay, also if you want to pose a question in a different language than English, we have great capacity for translation.
Okay, thank you very much. Manuela, you raised the question how, in the beginning, how to change the narrative. And I was wondering, I've been thinking about that myself, and I was thinking about the discussion about populism now, going on for 20 years or more even, since the 90s. It just struck me that have we ever seen the experiment in Europe that one established major party, like a social democratic party or Christian Democrat or liberal party, have kind of stuck to their guns, and stood up? I don't think we've seen that experiment, so I don't know, but I want to hear your reflection on that question, and because I believe that one dynamic you haven't spoken so much of, a little from Austria, but the huge importance of this movement of the political landscape when these parties come up, and I would question that this started with Brexit. You mentioned that this acceptance of populist parties, because I think we've seen, not least from the populist parties themselves, claiming they are just ordinary workers and so on, and that many other parties have kind of went along with that and really been nervous about if they're ordinary people or not so important, but if they're 20%, they're 20%. So it's important voters. So that was a comment.
Thank you. Okay, the first, who'd like to
That's the
answer?
third one.
Yeah.
We can take it.
Okay, let's take third one. Please remember the questions, though. Which one you want to...
Of course not.
I will just talk.
I have a pen for exactly this purpose.
First, thank you for the lecture. I come from Brazil, so the professor said it a lot. The case of Bolsonaro and one of the Chicago boys that is really going into huge reform. We started with like the labor reform, and now we just passed the pension reform. So it's really going like really fast and strange. But then you said that in these times of polarization, we should focus on people that don't believe anymore in politics. And I see this belief in Brazil that people just they vote for the person, they don't vote for the party, they don't think that the political debate is important anymore because political are just not trustable. And I agree with you, but then as Brazilian, I see that Bolsonaro didn't won the elections because of the neoliberal ideology. He won because he has people in power that has afforded many fake news. So his win is really related like with fake news on people that don't have any political knowledge about the situation, and not on the neoliberalism ideology in itself. Like people don't believe in neoliberalism in Brazil, like big as ideology, but in fake news that were spread via conservative government and project. So this is what worries me. Like, how can we overcome this situation if he has people who have the power to influence in a scale that it's difficult to overcome? I'm sorry if I'm really pessimistic, but I just wanted to hear what you had to say about that. Thank you.
Okay, so let's have a few answers. Who would like to begin?
Let's start.
I think I prefer the big one. Thank you. First about the remark, just to clarify, I didn't mean that it was the first time with Brexit that people said, oh, it's the people. I just meant that many people on the left started making this argument. And so I was not clear about that, but that's what I meant. Second, about voters. My general assumption is that we should sort of bet on the fact that people are not stupid, which is a dangerous assumption, I realize, but I'm willing to take the risk. And in particular, I think we have empirical confirmation of that. That is, when people vote for Trump and people say, oh no, they did not realize he was a neoliberal, and then he does what he does, and they still support him. And some say he could do this or he could do that, but as long as he builds the wall, I'm fine. Well, they're not stupid, they're just fascists. And I think we should not imagine voters to be stupid, because otherwise we're missing out the fact that many of them are fascists. And today, I think that's the main concern. It's not that people are dumb, it's that their beliefs I hate. And they hate me conversely, so the world is fine. So to me, it's fundamental not to think that people are deluded, because they're not more stupid than I am. It's just that we don't see the world the same way. It's not a matter of intelligence. It's not a matter of being misinformed, etc. Which leads me to the question about fake news. Of course, fake news matters, but the question is, how come you believe certain fake news and not others? And I realized that in Brazil, because I'm working with people in Brazil on these issues, I realized that in Brazil, many are tempted to think, well, that's because there's so much ignorance in the population, etc. But it tends to be educated people who've bought the fake news. So it means that they wanted to believe that. And my main argument about all this is that we have to think of the pleasure that people take in believing this stuff. What I call in French the jouissance of believing that the candidate, the PT candidate, is a pedophile, for example, which was part of the fake news in the last few days before the election.
But all the jouissance that there is in just sort of humiliating blacks, the jouissance that there's in humiliating gays, etc., etc. And I think that's fundamental for understanding what's going on. In general, I think it's not about ignorance. It's not about being mistaken. It's really about what people desire. I think we have to understand fascism as a desire for fascism, not as a mistake. People don't need to be enlightened. They need to be fought.
Well, I think I would like just to slightly challenge what you said now from the perspective of Serbia. I think definitely you're right to some point, but also when you're coming from a country where there is a very, very strong control over media and where is a very well, I don't know to whom, but let's say to some people, visible, deliberate, and very thoughtful propaganda. So you see that people who are working for the regime are really listening to the people and to their desires, to their fears, to their wishes, any possible way. And they are responding very efficiently to this in order to remain in power. So I mean, yes, in a way that is true, but also you have something, and I want to just to answer to you about they are not using neoliberalism something. I mean, this is very abstract concept for most of the people. What is neoliberalism? But what is not abstract and what they are using is something which we would call identity politics, but basically, we have a huge affair between our President Vučić and the President of Croatia, Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović. That is a huge issue. Or it's a huge issue that somebody from opposition in Serbia met with Kosovar representative. That is a really huge issue. So everything is going back to this identity conflicts, ethnic conflicts in Balkans, which are actually blurring what is happening behind the curtain and blurring this neoliberal marketization, basically, in our countries. So in a way, there are attempts to fight back, but these attempts are not led on this I would say, left ideological base, because people who are actually left in the political spectrum are deliberately deciding not to use a left dictionary and not to talk about socialism, not to talk about equality. They talk about everyday life and how they can help citizens to achieve better quality of everyday life in their neighborhood. That is the focus. Whether they are maybe falling in the trap of neoliberalism, of refusing to fight ideological battle, but this is the basically decision which they made upon evaluation that they cannot win any votes based on left ideology for the moment. On what reason? I mean, we can go deeply into reasons, but this is what is the case, for example, in Balkans.
I think I'd like to pick up on the question of the relation between authoritarian populism and neoliberal policies, because I think I agree I do agree in general with how you portrayed that relationship, and that's authoritarian populism being a certain political mode of the current conjuncture of neoliberal capitalism. I would just add that I think we need some more we need to look at local specificities a little more, and it just I'm saying this because a colleague of mine, an economist, Joachim Becker in Vienna, produced a very interesting report last year where he looked at the actual economic policy programs of right-wing parties across Europe, either as the party programs or in the cases where they are part of actual governments, the economic policies that they actually implemented. And one of his conclusions was that it's not as straightforward as we might have thought, and that there are in fact some far-right parties, and he especially referred to Poland, but also to Slovakia, and in some ways also to Hungary, where it would be quite a stretch to call those economic policies neoliberal in the sense that we have come to understand the term. They are in some ways expanding some sections of the welfare state according to a very specific, usually patriarchal and racist model of an exclusionary welfare state. But I think that this is a different model than what we usually understand as neoliberal economic policies. Which is not to say that, and on the other hand, you have the other extreme, and the Austrian Freedom Party certainly is one where it's very obvious that the far right is a means of pushing through, of rolling out neoliberal economic reforms in the interest really of big capital, of internationalized finance capital, and other.
Can I just say one sentence?
Sure.
I was talking about people in power,
Yeah,
not programs.
In Poland, the example given by, I'm not the expert on economic policies, but the report was quite convincing that, for example, in Poland, the types of economic policies that were implemented would not qualify as what we see in other contexts, in other places, as neoliberal economic policies. The second thing I wanted to say was reacting to your question or your comment on the normalization of right-wing, far-right parties. And it also kind of connects with what Stefan said before. Because I think we see a lot of times that far-right parties pursue a kind of double strategy, which means that on the one hand, they insist that they want to be part of the new normal, if you like. They want to be seen as a party like everyone else because they want to be invited in places like the university that you mentioned, and they want to be in TV talk shows, and they want to use all those opportunities. And in the end, they want to govern, just as any other party does. At the same time, they also use what I sometimes refer to as the hooligan strategy. No one likes us, we don't care. And it's a matter, it's not, if you look at the different trajectories of different right-wing parties, far-right parties, authoritarian populist parties in Europe, you will find that they use one or the other strategy in different combinations at different points points in time. You never see only one and never the other. But there are in the Austrian case, this is pretty clear, I think. You see a certain at some points you see a kind of point of no return, where the normalization has reached a kind of degree where some of the counter strategies that we try to implement seem to no longer work in any meaningful way. I mean, my own personal history of politicization was protesting against the FPÖ in 2000. And there was thousands and thousands of us. And now I think in Germany, there was, how many were there at the AfD Parteitag? It was a huge number now. Tens of thousands just recently protesting against the party meeting. But there seems to be a point when the normalization has reached a degree where they are really just treated as any other party in the political scene and on the media, then it is extremely difficult to get back to a point in time where this is not the case. And then I think also the counter strategies have to adapt accordingly.
Yeah, just to be brief. So how can we provide other narratives? That's the question, right? And I think, that there's a long history of, understanding that racism doesn't make really much sense to explain societies, and that we have that we have a big repertoire of explaining the world otherwise. So it seems sometimes that we are a bit, we are disappointed that we are not being heard, or it seems we're not being heard, and I think that it has a lot to do, what I find in many instances, that there is this degree of politeness and a degree of being convinced that democracy allows us to listen to anti-democratic statements to a degree that they are undermining democracy, and we will still say, but for democratic reasons, we have to accept that they are undermining and reorganizing democracy to a degree that we will not recognize it anymore. That seems to be like a collective refraining at the moment, and this is very strange. Because I think what we need to do, for one, is to not accept the explanations that provide other narratives that I think we really have. And we have to, get out. Because, this is an unfair question, but if I would ask how many of you actually really think that the Sweden Democrats provide politics that you think is useful to get us through the next decades. Seriously believe that maybe there is an alternative to how that they provide. I don't think you do. This is wrong.
That's unnatural.
We don't believe in conspiracy theories, but
Use the small one. This one's I think it's just gave up.
Okay. So, Emanuel.
No, it's fine.
Did you conclude?
Yes, I guess that's a nice ending. So if that's the truth, so if you don't believe in this, you have to say it. People have to speak out. It has to be said. It has to be, demonstrated for being put through in academic seminars. You have to speak to your neighbors, etc., etc. And you have to contradict them. That's labor, and yes, we can't be lazy, but this is what is at stake. That we can't be polite about these people and, to just, echo what Éric has said. It needs to be fought. And we have to do it. Sorry.
Thank you so much, the whole panel. One more round of applause for Manuela. There will be, for those who'd like to stay and chat for a while, you can have a peanut and a glass of...
One peanut.
And a glass
Please
of,
have a peanut.
Of beverage down there in the corner. I should also say, if you let me please, that we have 2 publications from our master's program here, those who would like to read a little bit about what our students do. And then, thank you all for coming. We will continue to read, think, speak, and struggle. So thanks for coming.
Thank you so much.
We've made up our minds. We're going to do new. Do something else. Do more. Do the impossible. Do better. Do good. Do big. Do small. Do it wrong. Do it again. Do it ourselves. Do it together. Do what no one else has done. Do what will become big. Do the same. Do different. Do everything. Do something. Do new.